so much. So George, I have a few questions here, if you don't mind me just jumping in. And the first one is that, you know, when we were researching your own personal story, you have quite an interesting personal story. Your parents were Holocaust survivors and you were born in Hungary. Has that shaped your passion for foreign policy and looking at conflict?
Well, you know, it's taught me that the worst can happen. So, I mean, one of the things that I learned during, you know, I wasn't in the Holocaust, but my parents were, but afterwards in the Cold War and things like that, is that expectations that everything will work out really need to be examined. It's not that they won't work out, but it's not self-evident they will. It didn't so much give me a pessimistic view of the world. It gave me, I think, a view of the world that really disliked ideologies. I mean, systematic packages of thought. It taught me to dislike people who I know what their position is on something without having to ask them. Because these people become dangerous sometimes. And it also taught me that you know, there's such a thing as justice. It's hard to define, but you'll know it when you see it. And you know, you have to somehow pursue it. So yeah, it taught me a lot of things, but the most important thing it taught me was skepticism about simplistic optimism.
Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting phrase, actually. I was quite intrigued at the beginning of the book where you were talking about how relatively unimportant the leadership of a country is, or at least that's the way I interpret it, given all of the massively powerful forces that are shaping the future of the country, because we get very caught up in the day-to-day, what's Obama doing, what's Congress doing, are they getting along, are they not getting along, what are they going to do in January with the debt ceiling? So I walked away from that, from reading that particular section thinking, well, maybe none of that matters as much as we're led to believe it does by CNN.
Well, to my life it matters because I live in the short run.
Right.
And in the short run, mistakes happen. But the fact of the matter is presidents in the United States are not very powerful. They don't decide what happens in the economy. They need Congress. They're stronger in foreign policy. But we created an institution that did strange things in the United States. On the one hand, it's the only position that's elected by all the people. They all participate in the selection. On the other hand, his ability to actually decide something is so circumscribed. That's very difficult. So what a president can do in the short run is provide leadership, which is a very vague term because leaders that I really liked, others hated, and so on and so forth. The important thing to understand is, and this is part of forecasting, so what is it that he can't do? And when you look at a president or you look at your prime minister, ask the question first, what institutionally is beyond his ability to do? And then to ask the question, well, politically, what can't he do? And then take a look at the things that he can do, realistically. And then you find he has very limited choices. I'd also say about the United States that our founders really distrusted government. And they created a government that didn't work. They created a Congress that was divided between two houses, a president who really had unclear authority, and a Supreme Court that wound up able to block everybody. They wanted a government that didn't act, except in extreme emergency. They then, in addition, created 50 states, and each of those states are different and governed differently, and they can participate in Obamacare or they can't participate in Obamacare. And this is what the founders wanted. Because for them, the heart of American society was not about politics, but about private life. The home, the family, the business, and things of that sort. So when you visit the United States and you want to do business, you don't go to Washington. There's no business to be done unless you want to sell something to the government. You go to Houston, you go to Seattle, you go to Chicago, you go to Silicon Valley, you know, whatever business you're in. The power is dispersed. In that circumstance, presidents come and presidents go. I lived through Jimmy Carter. I can live through anything. I was with the government at the time, and Jimmy Carter passed the worst law I ever said. It said, you can't accept gifts over $5. And I was at the Paris Air Show in 1981, and British Aerospace, I'm not sure what it was called then, had a wonderful pavilion. And the hostesses were magnificent. The food was outstanding, and I wasn't allowed in because it was more than $5 in gratuities. This is when I decided to leave government. So my point is, on that level, Jimmy Carter made decisions. As a president, he was a disaster, in my opinion. He was awful. We survived.
So that's quite a contrarian view, if I may say, that, you know, right now, that because there is so much focus on you know, the decline of the American empire, not that it's happening imminently, but that there's definitely this trend. You look at things in such a different way. When people say, are you a contrarian, how do you react to that?
Well, I would be a contrarian if I took a look at the popular view and said I wanted to be different. Since I mostly ignore the view, I guess I wind up in contrary positions. But for me, it's a historical question. You say the United States is in decline. If I hadn't had the same argument from Jimmy Carter, you know, after Vietnam, with the stagflation and the oil embargo and everything else in the 1970s, if I hadn't read about the same arguments being made in the Great Depression, that the United States and democracy can't survive, and totalitarianism and authoritarianism, we constantly hear that, and that's the strength of the United States. Mm-hmm. The United States itself doubts itself deeply, and that makes it possible for it to overcome things. Countries that are very complacent and very self-satisfied never can overcome a challenge because they don't even see one. So one of the things that I look at in the United States is, I remember when Japan in the 1980s was seen as this awesome power that was going to overwhelm everything and could take over everything. And the Americans were completely panicked. One of the things that came out of that was the microchip in Silicon Valley. So when the Americans panic, Sputnik went into space, my God, the Russians will do it, we got Apollo. If we talk about the Americans, two things to understand. The Americans are manic depressive. They're constantly saying we are the gift of God to the earth and we're collapsing. Usually the same person, the same speech. And what happens is a tremendous amount of energy is released. And it's ugly, it's messy, and everybody, I mean, certainly we're a very uncomfortable country to be a neighbor of. Mm-hmm. But it's not clean, and the founders didn't want it clean. They didn't want an efficient government. They wanted efficient businesses.
Mm-hmm. How is the sound, by the way? Are we echoing, or is that just me? We're good? Good in the back? Okay. Well, and it's interesting when you say about complacent countries, because I have a worry that Canada and that Canadians are somewhat complacent because we've had it pretty easy. We've been able to ride on the coattails of the American economic machine. We're very thrilled with ourselves right now in the wake of the financial crisis with our banking system. How do you see Canada?
I mean, I'm not a Canadian. This is very dangerous to say, but I've spent a good deal
because you're supposed to say you really like it here. We're in beautiful mountains.
I actually do, and we went vacation here, and my wife's family went to Australia from Newfoundland, from Nova Scotia. So I don't have any street creds really, but I'll say it. I can't talk about Canada. When the maritime states are so different from Quebec. Quebec is so different from Ontario. Ontario is so different from the Plains. And everybody's different from Vancouver and British Columbia.
And we're proud of it.
I actually have a strange view, which is that you're not an east-west country, even though you appear to be. You're a north-south country. British Columbia is more like Washington and Oregon. When I go to Calgary, I could be in North Dakota or other places. Ontario reminds me of the American Midwest. Quebec reminds me of nothing that I can think of. It's one of a kind. That's not a criticism. It's a one-of-a-kind country. So, I mean, it's a country that's east to west and yet faces south. But on the other hand, you have a neighborhood that really doesn't want anything from you. And I think that disappoints you sometimes.
We particularly wish they wanted our pipelines at the moment, but that's a different conversation.
Well, I mean, it's not, Houston looks at your pipeline and says, what's going to be delivered to Texas? Oil. Do we really want Canadian oil in Houston, Texas? It's more complex than that, but it's not simply the environmental issues. There's a lot of politics involved. On the other hand, you don't particularly like it when we flood your country with goods. And I remember Shakes and Shingles, which I once came here and was reading headlines about, and I had no idea what Shakes and Shingles were. I've never seen one. But, well, what I discovered was that something that was driving Canada wild had never been published in an American newspaper as an issue. So what I take away from this is Canada's in a difficult position next to the United States. It also enables Canada to do marvelous things. I don't think you can understand Canada without the United States.
Mm-hmm. Just before we break into the questions, I was quite fascinated, your thoughts on the next great world war. For those of the audience who haven't read the book, which I'll tell you a secret, is probably a lot more than care to admit it, can you just do a little summary? Because I think it's really interesting to think about what may happen in 2050.
Well, what I was asking first was, what countries would emerge? So, for example, in 1900, the country that emerged was the United States. It was a third world country, wasn't expected, here it was. There's always a new country emerging. Who is it going to be? And it seemed to me there were three countries. One was Poland, and Poland because I see Germany in decline, I see it deeply troubled. And Poland, when I wrote this book, everybody thought I was totally insane on Poland, but now it's become one of the faster growing countries in Europe. Turkey, because by nature, when Islam merges, it has a Turkic master. The Ottoman Empire survived for years, and the Islamic world is in shambles, and it's not going to remain in shambles. And so we will see. I said Turkey would rise, and it did. And Japan, which I regard as the major power of Asia, not China, that it's militarily much stronger than China. It's economically, we can debate the difference. It's either third or second, depending on whose lies you believe. And I saw these three powers as rising. And what I saw was that the United States does not like powers emerging. It's very happy having very weak powers. And I thought that what was going to happen was that the United States would find itself particularly at odds with the Japanese and with the Turks. The Turks becoming a major Mediterranean power, the Japanese becoming a Pacific power, and we are a maritime power who doesn't like it. Then I talked about what the war would look like. And in the same way that World War II turned out to be an air war, I expected a war, which I arbitrarily set in 2050, to be a space war. And beginning in space and being dominated by space. That's not really far-fetched. It's happening in many ways. The war itself, I mean, was notional. I'm not saying that this is the year it's going to happen. I'm not going to say it's going to happen this way. But there has been no century in human history that did not have a major systemic war. Now, you can say that this is going to be the first one, but, on the odds, I'll go against you. So the question I was asking here was, look, the 19th century had the Napoleonic Wars, the 20th century had the First and the Second World War. What's the 21st century going to have? Well, it's not going to have a repeat of the Second World War, and the French are not going to get another Napoleon. What's it going to be? And so I developed, I was looking at the rising powers. So far, we're seeing the decline of China, the relative rise of Japan. Turkey has certainly been extraordinary as economic power and stumbling as a political and military one. And Poland has surprised everybody, so I'm not too ashamed of the forecast. But that's really what I was doing.
Mm-hmm. We've got a bunch of people who have lined up for questions, so we'll start with Michael at table 10, I think, or unless I've got the order wrong. There we go.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm really asking this on behalf of Leah because David's not here tonight. And that is, what is China going to do with all their single men?
I have a number of answers, all of which would be unacceptable in this company.
It's a closed room.
No, people talk about the problem of the one child and surplus men, and I think here's another case where the statistics are not nearly as severe as that. This one-child policy was followed in some places and totally ignored in others. And it's not clear to me that the problem is nearly that bad, but you might wind up with some really ugly, highly irritated men. And that's as stupid as an answer as I can give.
So, well, they also say, though, about, what's interesting about China is that there's a lot of companies that are no longer using China as a place for manufacturing. So where do you see these other sort of low-wage, high-growth countries? Where are they now, but where are the next places on the horizon?
Well, China itself is shifting its production out of China. They're going to a lot of different places. We did a study called PC16, which is the post-China 16. So China replaced Japan. In a certain sense, Japan replaced Germany. It's not altogether fair. Who replaces China? Well, there's no one country that can replace China, so we found 16. And what we did was we took a look at 3 startup commodities. One is garments, parts of garments that are frequently manufactured in low-wage areas and they ship somewhere else to be assembled. Shoewear, footwear, and cell phone installation. Cell phone assembly, I'm sorry. And these 3 things, when we went back to the beginning of China in '78, cell phones weren't there, but other things electrical were. These were easy to move, easy to invest in, and easy to organize people into doing. And there were companies, entities, particularly in India, that were handling a lot of this and moving the jobs around the world in order to do it. And the countries they went to, it's not a forecast. So the question was, where were these guys going to? It's very strange. It's the Indian Ocean Basin. Africa is a particular concentration. Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. Sri Lanka was another one. Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Indonesia, the Philippines, and also in Latin America, Peru, Mexico, Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua. Now, do all of these stay on the list? I don't know. Do others join it? Possibly. But what happens is that you start organizing workers, frequently women, to do these things. Money begins to flow in, you begin upgrading, you now have a trained workforce, you add additional tasks, and this is how China did it. This is how Japan did it, because if you looked at Japan and South Korea in 1950, the last thing you would expect would be economic growth. If you looked at China in 1978, 7 years after the Cultural Revolution, coups and counter-coups, Madame Mao in prison, assassination attempts, Lin Piao crashing. I mean, the last thing you would have said was that anything could happen in this place that was halfway decent. So you're looking for a place that really is crummy. Mm-hmm. The second thing you're looking for is a workforce that can be organized. And third, you're looking for minimal infrastructure you can ship the stuff out. And we didn't do that. We didn't go looking for it. The various people doing the jobbing on this did. And this is what we found. So the next generation, we think, will see a diffused China, if you will, a diffusion of low cost, low wage, high growth. But we will also therefore see, because we see in other countries that took off, we'll also see a new distribution of wealth and social stress and everything else. But don't be fooled by the fact that I said Uganda, although I never thought I'd say anything good about Uganda in my life. It is exactly that kind of country. The place that you least expect any recovery or any development that develops.
We've got a Gavin, I think, at table 17.
George, in the next decade, you lay out a particularly clear-eyed and cynical view of the war on drugs. As you may or may not know, there's an active debate about marijuana legalization or decriminalization in Canada. And I'm curious if you could firstly lay out that thesis from the next decade, secondly talk about the implications for Canada of that thesis, and thirdly talk about what you think would be the implications if Canada were to move toward legalization of marijuana.
A new dimension of American tourism would open up. Look, there's a game that's played out between the United States and Mexico. The Americans say we've got to stop illegal Mexican immigration and do absolutely everything to make sure it happens. The Mexicans say we have to do everything we can to stop drugs and do everything they can to make sure it doesn't stop. The Mexicans don't have a drug problem. One estimate, which is pretty reasonable, is they get about $40 billion a year from drug sales. A reasonable estimate is that's about an 80% profit margin. That means $32 billion in drugs. If we assume 10% profit margin, which is very high, on legal drugs, they're making more money off of drugs than they are off of everything else they export to the United States. You got to be crazy to think they're going to stop that. I mean, $32 billion? Why was Cancun building new hotels in 2008? Nobody could get financing for anything, but they were building in 2008. Where did the money come from? So, the Americans politically cannot stop the drug trade. Or more precisely, they could, but no president wants to fight this fight. So we are going to keep drugs illegal. The Mexicans are not going to stop the drugs from coming in for two reasons. One, they can't, which really should be the only reason you want. And two, in a country that has a very constrained financial system, it's underbanked, this is a wonderful source of liquidity. Now, all the money doesn't go to Mexico. Some of it winds up in American banks, some of it goes to, but the money goes somewhere. Now, the Canadians are already driving us crazy with their legal drug policy, which is that absolutely everybody wants to get drugs, that the government is doing everything they can to stop it. We're starting to legalize drugs, which is really funny because you're going to have a bunch of states with legal marijuana and massive arrests of marijuana traders. It's, only we could do this. From my point of view, I mean, the Canadians are likely to make the decision, I think, to legalize. It's, from a cultural point of view, laissez-faire is very comfortable to the Canadians. And I'm not joking. I mean, I like going to Banff. But imagine how many tourists you get to Banff if you could go there and get stoned. So I would look at it from your point of view as a real cash flow issue.
I love it. Okay. I don't even know how to respond to that. We'll go to Lorena. One of
the things that I like to do is, the drug problem. Right. Let's face facts. People are making a huge amount of money. They're not going to stop. Okay? People like to get stoned. We know that because they're buying the stuff. People come to Canada for a few things. You make it legal, they're going to come here more. Facing the obvious is the entire game that you have to play. And what's obvious is that I can go to Toronto and get wasted. Well, I could think of doing that or a comfortable evening in the Library of Congress, but this is what will happen. Now, the Canadians may not admit this, but this is what they're thinking.
Justin Trudeau admitted that.
Was he stoned at the time?
Well, that's a good question. He's definitely been stoned recently in his tenure at office, but we weren't sure if he was stoned at the time. We'll go to Lorena.
Thank you very much for your interesting comments. I'd like to come back to Canada. You've alluded to our unique geographical location, north-south friendly neighbor, east-west, oceans. I think it's rather unique in the world. And I'm wondering how you would suggest we exploit this geographical location.
Drug tourism? No,
Everything, Lisa.
I think you are exploiting it. I mean, you know, this is a country of limited population and actually limited size in terms of its population, its concentration. It's a strip along the North American, along the United States border. It's not completely that, but it's heavily that. You have developed products the United States needs, i.e. minerals and oil. You maintain your own culture separate, different to the extent that you want it. You get involved in our wars only when you feel like it. It would seem to me that the Canadians have done a pretty good job managing their relationship with the United States and benefit from it. I'm not sure what more you can do. You can find more things to sell us, but I mean, you've got the good stuff. You've got oil and minerals. You also have a vibrant tech industry and other things. So I guess the point is, when it's said that Canadians are self-satisfied, they have reason to be. And sometimes you can't push your position because the last thing you want is the United States angry at you that you are dumping goods on us. This is not good for Canada. So the fact that you have all these things and the United States doesn't spend much time thinking about you, that's what you want. You do not want the United States focusing on you as the Canadian problem.
Well, and that's an interesting comment in this, to come back to something we were talking about earlier. You had suggested that one of the ways that Alberta, we can have this conversation since we're not there right now, that they would be far better off to stop focusing and trying so hard to build pipelines to the United States or a pipeline through Northern Gateway. If you're a pipeline company, that there's so many other places in the world that Canadians could be focusing on. Are we still too American-centric in that sense?
Well, you can't not be America-centric. It's a country of over 300 million people, and it's a market that you want to have access to, and you have that access, so you can't be indifferent. At the same time, you have to recognize that your major play, oil, is a large question mark. Not so much that new technology have created new access to oil, but we don't know what the price is going to look like. We don't know, we have some sense of demand. We don't know what global demand is going to look like. And it's very hard to really predict. I sometimes have to admit that I can't figure out what's holding oil up. But it is, so I'm obviously missing something. What will it be in 5 years? You don't know. So one of the things, if you want to be in the oil industry, it seems to me, is that you have an increased regionalization of markets. And Canada does not want to bet on one market. So the technology you have, the expertise you have, and so on. And you're doing this. I mean, this is not something I'm preaching. You're really doing it in minerals and, you know, diversifying the portfolio of Canadian companies so they're not singularly dependent on the United States, or more precisely, not singularly dependent on one market. We already have segmentation of the gas market. If the oil market segments so there's a different North American price or a different North American dynamic, it would seem reasonable that looking at Latin America and participating in that, which you're doing, and other places in the world would make a great deal of sense. Canada cannot avoid betting on the United States, and it doesn't mean it has to make an unhedged bet. And I think that is the strategic view, which is that Canada, the keystone, the future of the keystone cannot be the foundation of Canadian, because that's not in your control. It may happen, may not. There are other places to operate, not selling the oil necessarily, although that too, but developing oil, developing minerals.
I promised Jock, who we picked on earlier because he was the easiest economist we had access to, that we'd give him a chance to redeem himself with a great question. So, Jock, I think we've got a microphone right behind you.
Well, thanks. I enjoyed your talk, and sitting at a table with some distinguished investment bankers, I hesitate to raise this topic, but I'm going to anyway.
So stand back.
Growing income inequality. And I wanted to ask whether, how you think about it. In particular, just a couple of data points. The share of income in America, it's not too different here, by the way, flowing to the top 1% of the population is back to where it was in the 1920s, sort of the Gilded Age. And there seem to be very powerful forces that continue to push that. Median real wages have stagnated for 30 or 35 years, which was not the case in the first 35 years after World War II. Does this trend matter in terms of the political and sort of strategic analysis you do? And how do you see it playing out over the next 10 and 20 years?
It matters a great deal. I'm not too concerned with income inequality. Americans accept inequality. I'm concerned with the absolute level of consumption. Both Canadians and Americans have a definition of middle-class life. The median income in the United States pre-tax right now is about $49,000 a year for a family of four. After taxes and everything else, this pushes down into low 40s, sometimes below. When we came to this country after a few years, my father was able to buy a house, own a car, go on vacations. We were as lower middle class as you could be, but it still allowed us to take a vacation, not a very elegant one, but we had a life. My mother didn't work. Okay. Middle class life in the 1950s meant certain things you would have. It's no longer clear to me that even a person with median income can have that life any longer. At a take-home pay of called $3,500 a month, having a house you can probably do. You can squeak by. Go down any further on that scale to where I used to live, and you can't have the things. So I'm not concerned with income equality. That's kind of a moral question that really doesn't move people. What moves people is that the middle class life is barely in the reach of the middle class, of the literal middle class, and is not in the reach of the lower middle class. There are a range of reasons for this. One of them is the trend toward unmarried families, which leaves women in the most places at a tremendous disadvantage because they don't have legal rights or anything else. And that really brings down the numbers, because you wind up with women and children and education issues and stuff like that. That's a massive impact. So while I applaud my children having lived together and avoided tremendous mistakes by actually trying it, there's also a tremendous danger in the decline of marriage, because as an economic unit, it's more efficient. The second problem is, however, the investment bankers, of which I'm close enough to this point that I shouldn't. But here's the problem. We re-engineered the corporation. The 1950s corporation was a giant dinosaur. It didn't work. We took that corporation, broke it apart, restructured it, reshaped it, and continued this process ad infinitum. When my father came to this country, he got a job at a printing company, and it was expected that he would retire from that printing company. He didn't quite, but it was close. It was expected that there was a version of American lifetime employment that put you on an escalator over the years, not sumptuous, but would take you from here to there. This also bred inefficiencies into the system that I'm fully aware of and killed Detroit. But what happens now is that every time the company is re-engineered, you're knocked off the escalator. You no longer are with that corporation with 11 years in and heading to 13 and 15 and so on. you're back at the beginning. The benefits from the re-engineered corporation move to the elite, the 1% that you were talking about. That is, the way we managed the re-engineering, which was absolutely necessary because of the tax structure and everything else, accumulated with those who did the engineering, leaving the workers in a much more difficult position. The problem here is that in the long run, this won't be allowed to happen. Political steps will be taken to rectify it, and they won't be pleasant, and they won't be efficient, and they won't be smart with tax codes and stuff like that. But it's an impersonal force. You can't persuade a hedge fund manager to contribute voluntarily to a fund to raise pay. But because of that, we're going to be facing much higher tax rates. There are going to have to be transfers unless we are prepared to live in a world where we're not far away from that half the population can't enjoy the American and Canadian dream, that it no longer is available to them. And that, as I said in my talk, when the middle class loses its status, that's when things get explosive. And so my concern is, from a geopolitical point of view, this is the Achilles heel of the United States, and therefore of Canada as well. I think it can be solved, but I think it can only be solved, it will be solved in a crisis, which I expect. A more rational solution would be to look at it and say it can't go on, but that's not the way things work. So I fully agree that that is a geopolitical problem.
Because one of your specialties is obviously with natural resource companies that are going into other countries, I thought we'd end the evening, table 4, we've got a couple of big mining guys. So Ron, and then we'll end with Ross.
Thanks, George. Enjoyed that a lot. And, yes, in the natural resource business, I've subscribed to you for quite a while. Enjoyed your
there
opinions.
Is someone else. You're not the only one.
On many different countries, but actually I have a question about the United States.
Sure.
That is your proposition that business, by design, it's a country of business efficiency and government that is designed not to do too much. In my particular industry, it seems like the government's authority has been usurped by special interest groups when it comes to any kind of resource development.
Well, I mean, I'm absolutely in favor of mining so long as it's not on my property. Look, we have a problem with mining, which is that it's an intrusive enterprise. And we have a problem that we're discovering resources right in the middle of places where people live. We also don't have a rational strategy for dealing with this, because in the United States, at least, we object to government having rational strategies. It's called central planning. So we have an irrational one. I mean, one of the problems that the industry has is that we don't really have a shortage of minerals right now, and the price is not unsustainable. I suspect when this problem is going to be solved is the next cyclical shortage of minerals and their rise, and that will undermine the special interests. The government, the President of the United States is not there to make you happy. He's there to be reelected. And one of the things that I've observed, having been close to the industry, is they're really not very good. They're very good at taking out one-page ads in magazines that their opponents don't read. But they're not very good at, as an industry, understanding the political process they're engaged in. In an odd way, they feel the victim, but they have a great deal of power. It, however, means spending a great deal of time thinking about how to do it. When you go to Romania, you will spend a great deal of time thinking about these groups that are blocking you, or you won't be in Romania, and you know that. I think that the mining industry in the United States has been very inefficient, not in delivering its message, as in understanding the reasoning of its opponents and trying to find some middle ground. I don't mean to criticize the industry. I like sulfites very much. I'm simply saying that the blocking that's going on is partly due to the presentation and fragmentation of the industry. There are strategies that could be followed that I'm certainly not an expert on, okay, to find the basis. Or you can wait till high prices washes everything out.
Just before we go to our last question, I forgot I had one important one here, and it's quite a segue because it's about Africa. So can you comment on the role of Africa or African countries in the context of the next 100 years? And of course, the resource development there is absolutely amazing, the opportunities.
The opportunities have always been amazing. Mm-hmm. The ability to extract them have faced two problems, three. First, infrastructure. Second, labor. Third, governments. Apart from that, it's there for the getting.
You make it sound so easy.
When I look at the future and I talk about that East African phenomenon we see taking place, if that happens, and that'll be 10 or 15 years of maturing, suddenly capital, native capital, becomes available and can spread to other countries and, begin building the infrastructure that's necessary. Other than that, my great disappointment is South Africa. I had thought that this would be sort of the flywheel of Africa. Here was a country that combined the expertise of the white community, the political power of a sophisticated black community, and together they could create a new Africa. It's not worked out that way. It's possible that when Zuma, the last of the ANC fighters from Mozambique, passes from the scene, he'll be replaced by someone more sophisticated in the management of the system, but I don't think so. So we wait on the East Africans and see if that happens.
Great. We're going to go to Ross now for the final word. I just want to say something about Ross. You have made a comment earlier about how, you can listen to the numbers and there's all the statistics and then you can just get onto the ground and actually see what's going on in a country. And my very first conversation with Ross was about his I trip, his around the world trip, where he just gets on a plane and he goes to Mumbai, Dubai, and there's another I. And Shanghai, just to see what's going on there. So I think that you've really onto something about the...
Okay, thank you very much, George. I actually did read your book over the weekend, and I thought it was a very good book, very interesting, very, very fascinating. As a person who I also work all over the world, and it's kind of a very interesting place to obviously take observations from experience. A couple of comments. One that I'm going to start with that I saw from your book, I would either disagree with or maybe just observe, that sitting beside Helen Messier here, who's a geneticist and doctor, and has told me, fascinatingly, that I'm going to live till I'm 120, because humans are meant to live till they're 120. And I didn't know that. Yeah, welcome to the party. And so your book talked a lot about the change in demographics. The world's population is leveling off, negative. And if we get our genetics right, maybe we're going to be able to deal with that without having this crushing burden of old age on the young today. So that's one thing that may be a really radical change from the standpoint of things you observe in your book to things which may actually happen based on evolutions in science and medicine. The second was China. You make a good case for China basically breaking apart in 10 or 15 years. And becoming less important on the world stage. And one thing I think that was ignored was the diaspora, the Chinese diaspora. And we live it in Vancouver. We're a Chinese city, fundamentally. We're an Asian city now. It's evolved dramatically in the last 30 or 40 years. You see it, you just walk around the streets. And you wouldn't know it here tonight, but we're fundamentally an Asian city now, I think. And that power of the Chinese diaspora in Africa, in the resource business where we work, you just see it everywhere. The Chinese industries are dominating our business now. They're the biggest importers of commodities, and they're the biggest developers of commodities all over the world. South America, Africa, and in fact encroaching into North America now, especially in the oil field. So I think that was something that I would observe differently than you observe, and I don't think that'll lead to a breakdown of China in the next in my lifetime. And the third was something that I didn't see anywhere in your book, but I personally think is a really critical thing that will influence the next 100 years dramatically, and that is you didn't mention anything about the environment, or you paid a little bit of lip service to global warming, but nothing in terms of the ecological limits to growth. It is going to be, I think, an absolutely profound change going from today forward. Limits to growth in soil, in water, in land. Frontier land's gone. The earth is a very finite place where we're pounding it in terms of resource extraction. Resources are becoming more expensive, more difficult to mine, more difficult to get social licenses for. And that, I think, will be an absolutely profound change in our lifetimes, let alone the next 100 years, which I didn't see mentioned in your book.
I'll start with the work backwards. I did research the ecological question, and when I actually looked at the studies and everything else, they're not very good ones, and they contradict each other. So when you ask on a model, okay, everything you've painted is negative, which regions increase rainfall? Models don't have that. As somebody who does stochastic programming and things like that, any model that has only negative outcomes and has no positive is not an adequate model. I came away not knowing what everybody is so certain about. So one of the things that my job is to know what I don't know. It may well be that you're right, but I didn't include it in the book because I felt that aside from making assertions that I'm not comfortable with, I just couldn't do that. So yes, you're right, I avoided that question because I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the limits are. I have heard their limits, but remember, I grew through the time of the 1970s when Spaceship Earth was running out of everything and price of everything was going up, and then suddenly we discovered Spaceship Earth had more reserves than we thought we had. I've become very cautious, and I didn't want to get into that argument. The second question you asked was about
China and then the genetic age.
China is experiencing a massive capital flight, very similar to the one Japan experienced in 1990-91, very similar to the one that Taiwan and South Korea experienced in 95-96. The reason that massive amounts of investment are leaving China is that the Chinese have chosen to invest what money they have outside of China rather than in China. And that, I think, is a very telling thing. I don't think that's a sustainable model. I think it represents a business climax that's fairly, common. And again, yes, you are seeing a massive outflow of money. And the Chinese principle is, if it's not in China, I'll buy it. And they make some really bad deals, as you investment bankers know. So you have it. As to the diaspora, I'm not sure that Vancouver will stay a Chinese city, although it may have ethnic Chinese. New York was once a Jewish city, an Italian city. And then suddenly we became Jewish Americans and went on with our lives. One of the real questions is assimilation. There is massive movement into the United States, both from East Asia and South Asia. And one of the really extraordinary things of the past 30 years has been the level of integration, of assimilation that's been achieved of these groups, which heterodoxically you'd figure they'd be different, but they assimilate. There are some countries that they are going to that don't permit or facilitate assimilation. Canada and the United States are not one of them. So I would not be surprised to see Vancouver become a Canadian-Chinese city. I'll lay a long bet that they will not remain culturally Chinese beyond those things that we all retain. The first question was?
I think it was on the impact of longer lifespans.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very important issue. And the real question is, and this I didn't mention in the book, longer lifespans without degenerative diseases is a positive. If degenerative diseases aren't cured, a nation of Parkinson's sufferers, Alzheimer's sufferers, and so on and so forth, becomes a huge devastating thing. So the question that I will ask is, if we can genetically extend life, can we also solve, these degenerative diseases, and including degenerative disease of general weakness, which unfortunately I'm beginning to experience, which I'm sure will go away. It doesn't mean anything. But as if we imagine someone living 40 years of their life in a condition where he cannot produce and is a net consumer, of care, that's bad stuff. If we can, and really the question that really we have to deal with, and the single problem that we have to solve, is degenerative disease. Because as we do extend life expectancy, and we are now living, when Social Security in the United States was created, it was set at 65. That's because life expectancy for a male was 63. We have kept retirement age at 65. They're living to 80. If they can't work during that period of time, if they are unable to, they're a net consumer. So my son is a biologist, and he assures me this is not a genetic problem, but a molecular biological problem. He's a molecular biologist, of course, he wants funding. I don't understand that well enough to comment on it, really, although I'll go on and on. That really is the one that that and, what are the limits in the environment? I mean, that is one that you actually have to know science, and even the scientists seem to disagree or reaching coherent conclusions.
Just to take this opportunity, for those of you who are not engaged in our spring series yet, there's a speaker in April called Peter Diamandis, who's the co-founder of Singularity University, and they're quite proponents, I guess, from a scientific and technological advancement perspective, that if you can live another 20 years, you can almost live forever in terms of how advanced our society is going to be. And he also has some very interesting ideas, back to your point about resources, about how the world is going to become more and more abundant because of our use of technology and for energy and water and whatnot. So come back in the spring, and you'll get the answer to that.
I got to make another 20 years and I'll live forever.
Pretty much, yeah.
It's going to be close.
Anyway, George, I just want to say thank you so much on behalf of all of us for a fantastic conversation this evening. Thank you so much.